The biting December wind whipped through the deserted streets of Manhattan, carrying with it the last traces of snow that had fallen during the afternoon. Arthur Vasquez watched the city through the window of his armored Mercedes-Benz, his dark brown eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the buildings that passed like ghosts in the night. At 45, he had achieved everything money could buy, but on this particular night, something seemed different in the air. "You can stop here, Maxwell," he ordered the driver, his deep voice breaking the silence inside the vehicle. The digital clock read 11:47 p.m., and Fifth Avenue, normally vibrant, was strangely silent. Maxwell, who had been his private driver for 15 years, hesitated for a moment. "Mr. Vasquez, this is not an area." "I said stop," Arthur interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. The car glided smoothly to the sidewalk, and before Maxwell could react, Arthur had already opened the door, allowing the icy air to invade the vehicle's heated interior. It was then that he saw her, a young woman huddled against the wall of an abandoned building, clutching a small package to her chest. Her dark hair was partially covered by a worn cap, and her clothes, visibly unsuitable for the weather, gave away her precarious situation. Arthur felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced for a long time. Memories of his own childhood in a poor neighborhood in the Bronx began to surface, memories he had worked so hard to bury under layers of success and material wealth. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice softer than usual. The young woman raised her face, revealing green eyes marked by fear and exhaustion. The small bundle in her arms stirred, and a soft whimper cut through the silence of the night. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt us." The vulnerability in her voice hit Arthur like a punch in the gut. For a moment, he saw his own mother, decades ago, begging the landlord for more time to pay the rent arrears. "I'm not going to hurt you," he replied, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "My name is Arthur Vasquez. Can I help you?" The woman hesitated, her eyes alternating between Arthur and the parked Mercedes-Benz. "I'm Laura," she finally replied, her voice trembling. "And this is Noah," she added, adjusting the blanket that protected the baby. Maxwell had got out of the car and was watching the scene with apprehension. In 15 years of service, he had never seen his boss take an interest in any homeless person. Arthur Vasquez was known for his coldness in business and for maintaining strictly professional relationships. "It's too cold for you to stay here," Arthur said, removing his cashmere coat. "There's a hotel near here. I can arrange a room for you and your son tonight." Laura squeezed Noah even tighter against her chest. "Why? Why would you mind?" The question hit Arthur with unexpected force. Why did he care? His father's words echoed in his mind. "Feelings are for the weak, son. The strong do what needs to be done." For years, he had lived by this mantra, building an empire at the cost of his own humanity. Because, he hesitated, searching for the right words, because maybe I need to care more. The baby began to cry harder, and Laura tried to calm him down, her hands shaking with cold. Arthur stepped forward, offering his coat with a cautious gesture. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely," he said, "but it's very cold tonight, and your son needs a warm place to sleep. The hotel has security cameras on every floor, and you'll have your own key. No one will disturb you." Laura looked at Noah, then at the dark sky and finally at Arthur. Something in his eyes, perhaps the unexpected sincerity she found in them, made her nod positively. As Maxwell opened the car door for them, Arthur felt a strange sense of lightness. It was as if, for the first time in decades, he was doing something truly meaningful. During the short drive to the hotel, Arthur watched in the rearview mirror as Laura cradled her son, murmuring soft words of comfort. The scene triggered long-suppressed memories, his mother singing to him during the nights when they couldn't afford the heating, the smell of her vegetable soup made from the most basic ingredients, the tired but loving smile on her face. That night, while arranging the hotel room for Laura and Noah, Arthur Vasquez began to question every choice he had made over the last 20 years. The empire he had built suddenly seemed empty, and the walls he had built around himself were beginning to show their first cracks. Returning to his penthouse on the Upper East Side, Arthur stayed awake until dawn, his thoughts constantly returning to the young mother and her baby. Something had changed in him, a subtle but profound transformation that, although he couldn't yet name it, he knew would be impossible to ignore. Day was dawning over Manhattan, and with it, a new story was about to unfold. The next morning found Arthur Vasquez in his office on the roof of Vasquez Tower, a glass and steel skyscraper that towered over the city. Through the windows of the 78th floor, Manhattan stretched like an empire at his feet, but for the first time in years, the view didn't bring him the usual sense of power. "Mr. Vasquez, your board meeting starts in 15 minutes, announced Regina Mitchell, his executive assistant for a decade. Her heels echoed precisely on the marble floor as she placed a folder on the mahogany table. Arthur adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the reflection of the window, a mask of indifference cultivated by years of ruthless negotiations. However, the image of Laura and Noah persisted in his mind, a persistent crack in his armor of indifference. "Regina," he called, before she could reach the door, "I need you to do a discreet check. Hotel Riverside, room 1542. A young woman called Laura, with a baby." Regina arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow, but years of professionalism prevented her from questioning. "Is there any specific information you're looking for?" "Everything. History, documents, anything that can tell us who she is." The executive elevator opened its chrome doors, and Bernard Whitman, chairman of the board of Vasquez Enterprises, emerged with his characteristic calculated smile. Arthur, ready to destroy some more dreams today. It was a recurring joke between them, the way they turned failing companies into profit, regardless of the human cost. Arthur forced a smile, but the words now tasted bitter. In the meeting room, 12 executives were waiting, all wearing suits that cost more than a year's rent for an average family. The topic of the day was the acquisition of a network of community hospitals that was on the verge of bankruptcy. "As you can see from the figures," presented Davidson, the CFO, "we can convert 3 of the units into luxury private clinics. The other 5, he paused dramatically, will unfortunately have to be closed." "What about the patients?" The question escaped Arthur's lips before he could stop it. A disconcerting silence gripped the room. Bernard leaned forward, frowning. "Pardon? The patients?" Arthur repeated, his voice firmer. "Where will they go when we close the hospitals?" Davidson sniffed, uncomfortable. "Well, there are other public facilities within a radius of 20 kilometers. Arthur saw Laura, shivering on the sidewalk. How many other people like her depended on those hospitals? How many mothers with their babies? "No," he declared, surprising everyone, including himself. "Find another solution. We won't close hospitals that serve poor communities." Bernard let out a nervous laugh. "Arthur, be reasonable. The profit margin—" "I said no," Arthur cut in, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of unquestioned authority. "Review the project. I want alternatives that don't involve closures." Leaving the meeting an hour later, Arthur felt the confused and worried looks from his executives. In her office, Regina was waiting for him with a thin folder in her hands. "Laura Collins, 26, she began, as efficient as ever. Graduated in literature from the University of Michigan. Married to Richard Collins, a real estate entrepreneur. Or rather, she was married. There are records of multiple emergency room visits in the last 2 years. Fractures, bruises." Arthur closed his eyes, his jaw tensing. "Her husband?" Regina nodded. "She got a restraining order 3 months ago, right after Noah was born. Richard Collins froze all joint accounts, canceled credit cards. She literally ran away with her body clothes and the baby." The phone on Arthur's desk rang. Bernard Whitman was demanding an explanation for his behavior at the meeting. He watched the handset ring until it went silent. "Regina," he called again, his voice softer. "Cancel my appointments this afternoon, and prepare the documents to create a new foundation. Something focused on supporting women in vulnerable situations." "A foundation?" Regina couldn't mask her surprise. "That could generate comments in the council." "Let them comment," Arthur replied, standing up. "I also want you to prepare an apartment in the Edison building, something suitable for a single mother with a baby." As he rode the private elevator down to the garage, Arthur reflected on how a single night could change 2 decades of certainties. His phone vibrated. A message from Bernard. "We need to talk about your behavior. The council is concerned." Arthur put his phone away without answering. In the elevator mirror, he observed his own reflection, the impeccable $10,000 suit, the Swiss watch, the perfectly aligned haircut. All the hallmarks of his success now seemed like an elaborate costume, a mask that was beginning to weigh too much. Maxwell was waiting for him with his car. "Where to, sir?" "Hotel Riverside," replied Arthur, loosening his tie. It was time to do something truly meaningful with all the power he had accumulated. As the car glided through Manhattan traffic, Arthur thought about how he would explain his proposal to Laura. How would he convince a woman who had run away from a rich, controlling man to accept help from another rich man? The irony didn't escape him, but something had changed. For the first time in years, Arthur Vasquez wasn't thinking about profits, margins, or acquisitions. He was thinking about making a difference, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that he could. The weight of his past choices was still with him, but now there was also a lightness, a possibility of redemption that he had never considered before. And it had all started with a chance encounter on a cold winter's night. The Riverside Hotel maintained an elegant discretion, with its Art Deco facade and staff trained not to ask questions. Laura watched through the window of room 1542 as Noah slept peacefully in the makeshift crib the management had provided the night before. The last 24 hours had seemed like a hazy dream. The biting cold of the street, the well-dressed stranger, the sudden change in his fortunes. 3 soft knocks on the door made her freeze. Her fingers instinctively reached for the disposable cell phone she kept hidden, her only line of communication with the women's shelter that had helped her escape. "Ms. Collins?" Arthur's voice sounded on the other end. "It's me, Arthur Vasquez. Can we talk?" Laura hesitated, her eyes alternating between the door and Noah. The social worker at the shelter always warned about rich men offering to help. There was often a high price to pay, but something in his voice. "Just a moment," he replied, checking his appearance in the mirror. The hotel had provided basic hygiene products, and she had managed to wash herself properly for the first time in days. When she opened the door, she found Arthur holding 2 brown paper bags. "I brought lunch," he explained, keeping a respectful distance. "I thought we could talk." Laura nodded, allowing him in but keeping close to the open door. "Noah's asleep," she whispered, indicating the crib. Arthur placed the bags on the small table in the bedroom and began to take out containers of food. "I didn't know what you liked, so I brought you some options. There's salad, soup, sandwiches." "Why are you doing this?" Laura interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want in return?" Arthur stopped, his hands hanging over the containers. For a moment, he looked truly vulnerable. "Can I tell you a story?" Laura crossed her arms protectively, but nodded. "When I was 6, he began, taking a seat on one of the chairs. "My mother ran away with my father for the first time. He was, well, let's just say that Richard Collins isn't the only man who uses money as a weapon." The name of her ex-husband made Laura turn pale. "Did you look into me?" "I needed to know if you were really safe," Arthur admitted. "But let me continue. On that first escape, like, we ended up in a shelter in the Bronx. There was a lady there, Doña Carmen, who helped women like my mother. She didn't have much, but she shared everything she could." Noah stirred in his crib, making a small noise. Laura immediately moved towards him, but the baby just lay there, continuing his sleep. "My mother came back for him," Arthur continued, his voice lower. "She came back 5 times before she finally managed to leave for good. I was 12 when she died. Pneumonia, because he forced her to sleep in the garage one winter's night as punishment." Laura slowly sat down in the other chair, her defenses beginning to drop. "I'm sorry. I spent years burying that story," Arthur confessed. "I built an empire trying to prove that I was different from him, but in the process," he paused, running his hand over his face. "In the process, I may have become more like him than I'd like to admit. Until last night," Laura added softly. "Until last night," he agreed. "Seeing you and Noah was like being transported back to that shelter in the Bronx. And for the first time in decades, I was reminded of Doña Carmen, of how one small act of kindness can change everything." Laura reached out hesitantly, taking one of the sandwiches. "Richard," she began, her voice breaking. "At first, he was different, charming, attentive. We met at college. I had a scholarship in literature. He said my love of books was adorable." "When did you change?" Arthur asked gently. "Gradually. First it was comments about my clothes, then about my friends. When I graduated, he suggested that I didn't need to work. After all, he could give me everything. Then came the house rules, the controlled hours, the passwords to my emails." Noah began to cry, and Laura quickly got up to pick him up. Arthur watched as she soothed him naturally, murmuring sweet words. "The first time he hit me, she continued, still cradling Noah, was when he found out I was pregnant. He said that I had planned everything to trap him. Ironically, it was Noah who gave me the strength to leave. The idea of him growing up seeing that. You're stronger than you think, Arthur said. And I want to help, not out of pity or some kind of exchange, but because I can, because I should. Laura looked at him longingly, assessing, how do I know I can trust you? You don't know, Arthur answered honestly. But I promise to be transparent. I have an apartment in the Edison building, furnished, secure, with 24-hour concierge. It's been empty for months. I'm also setting up a foundation to help women in a similar situation to yours. You could help us structure it, with your experience. A job? Laura asked in surprise. A purpose, Arthur corrected. Your story could help other women, and you would have financial independence without depending on me or anyone else. Noah had fallen asleep again in his mother's arms. Laura gently placed him in his crib before turning to Arthur. When I was a child, she said softly, I read stories about knights in shining armor saving people in danger. After Richard, I learned that fairy tales don't exist. But maybe there are people trying to make up for their own mistakes by doing something good. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. So, you accept? Laura looked at Noah, then at the window that showed the city outside. A city that just a few days ago seemed so hostile, and now, inexplicably, offered a new chance. I accept, she replied, not for the fairy tales, but for the chance to write my own story. The move to the Edison building took place quietly on a Wednesday morning. Arthur watched from the lobby as Laura, carrying Noah, entered the elevator accompanied by Regina, who had personally coordinated every detail of the installation of the apartment on the 18th floor. Mr. Vasquez, called Maxwell, who was waiting near the car. Mr. Whitman called again. That's the 5th time this morning. Arthur adjusted the watch on his wrist, an automatic gesture that had become a nervous tick in recent days. The council had been in an uproar since its decision on the community hospitals, and the sudden creation of the foundation had only intensified the speculation. Tell them I'm in an important meeting, he replied, although he knew the excuse wouldn't last long. In the elevator, on the way to his office, Arthur reflected on the changes of the last few weeks. His cell phone vibrated. A message from Victoria, his ex-wife. We need to talk about your erratic behavior. Bernard called me. Typical. Victoria and Bernard had always been close, sharing the same ruthless view of business. It was no surprise that she was involved now. Mr. Vasquez. Regina met him as soon as the elevator doors opened on the top floor. The foundation's documentation is ready for your review, but, she hesitated, something rare in her always confident demeanor. But, the board has called an extraordinary meeting for this afternoon. It's about, well, everything. Arthur nodded, entering his office. On his desk, a blue folder contained the preliminary documents of the newly created New Dawn Foundation. Next to it, a stack of reports highlighted the potential losses from the decision to keep the community hospitals operating. Regina, he called, before she left. How is Laura adjusting? Fine, sir. The apartment is fully equipped, including a nursery for Noah. We've installed an additional security system and her. How is she? Regina allowed herself a small smile. Scared, grateful, determined. She spent the morning organizing books in the bookcase we provided. Noah seems to like his new surroundings. Arthur sat back in his chair, turning to look out of the window at the city. He remembered his own mother, how she used to organize and rearrange the few belongings they had, trying to create a sense of normality in the midst of chaos. The office door opened abruptly, and Bernard Whitman burst into the room, followed by Victoria. Regina gave him an apologetic look before leaving, closing the door behind her. What the hell do you think you're doing, Arthur? Bernard snapped, his normally controlled face now red with irritation. Good morning to you too, Bernard. Victoria, always a pleasure, Arthur replied calmly without turning around. Don't be sarcastic. Victoria advanced, her heels echoing on the floor. First the hospitals, now this foundation. The board is panicking. The shares have dropped 3 points since your little charity show. Arthur finally turned his chair to face them. Interesting how 3 points in the stock causes more panic than thousands of lives affected by our decisions. Oh, for God's sake! Bernard threw his hands up. Who are you and what have you done with Arthur Vasquez? The man who built this empire. Empire? Arthur repeated the word, feeling its weight. Do you know how much it costs to keep a community hospital running for a year, Bernard? Less than the yacht you bought last month. Victoria approached the table, resting her hands on it. Arthur, if this is some kind of midlife crisis. No, Victoria, this is clarity. For the first time in years, I'm seeing beyond the numbers. It's because of that woman, isn't it? Bernard interfered. The homeless woman you picked up. Regina can't keep a secret when pressed properly. Arthur felt his jaw tighten. Her name is Laura, and she's not the subject of this conversation. On the contrary, Victoria cut in. She is exactly the subject. What do you think the press will say when they find out that the powerful Arthur Vasquez is harboring a stranger? The speculation, the scandals. Enough. Arthur stood up, his voice carrying an authority that made them both recoil. Do you want to know what's going on? I'm tired. Tired of building fortunes on the suffering of others. Tired of justifying inhumane decisions with spreadsheets and graphs. Arthur, Bernard tried to intervene. I haven't finished. The hospitals will stay open. The foundation will be set up. And if the board has a problem with that, fine. I have 51% of the shares. Let them try to stop me. Victoria laughed. A cold, calculated sound. You really have changed, and not for the better. On the contrary, Arthur replied, his voice softer now. I'm getting back to who I should have been all along. The phone on his desk rang. It was Regina. Mr. Vasquez, Laura is on line 2. Something about Noah having a fever. Arthur didn't hesitate. I need to take this, he told his unwelcome visitors. Regina will show you out. As Bernard and Victoria left, casting furious glances at each other, Arthur picked up the phone. On the other end of the line, Laura's worried voice reminded him exactly why all these changes were worth it. I'm coming over, he said, reaching for his coat. I'll call the pediatrician who's been seeing the family for years. As the elevator descended into the lobby, Arthur found Maxwell already waiting with the car. On the way to the Edison building, he reflected on how, in just a few weeks, his priorities had changed so drastically. His phone vibrated again. More messages from the board, more veiled threats, more worries about the company's image. Arthur hung up the handset. There were more important things now than financial statements and quarterly reports. For the first time in decades, Arthur Vasquez was breaking down the walls he had built around himself, and although the process was painful and frightening, it was also incredibly liberating. Dr. Harrison's pediatric office maintained that typical welcoming atmosphere, with walls decorated with cartoon characters and a colorful aquarium in the reception area. Laura held Noah to her chest, while Arthur stood by the window, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the obvious concern on his face. It's just a common viral infection, explained Dr. Harrison, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. Nothing that a few days of rest and proper medication won't solve. Laura let out a sigh of relief, kissing Noah's still warm forehead. Are you sure? He's never been sick before? Absolutely, smiled the doctor, scribbling down a prescription. First fever is always scary for first-time mothers. Arthur watched the interaction, suddenly remembering his own mother, Carmela Vasquez, and her sleepless nights when he fell ill as a child. Those were the times when they couldn't afford private consultations, depending on the goodwill of doctors in public hospitals, the same hospitals he was now fighting to keep open. Dr. Harrison, Arthur approached, his voice softer than usual. Could you recommend any other pediatricians? We're setting up a network of professionals to assist families in vulnerable situations through the New Dawn Foundation. The doctor seemed genuinely interested. Of course, I have some colleagues who would be happy to contribute. Is this your project, Arthur? I confess I'm surprised. People change, doctor, replied Arthur, exchanging a meaningful glance with Laura. Back at the Edison building, Laura insisted on making Arthur a coffee as a thank you. The apartment, although luxurious, was already showing signs of her personality. Books organized by color on the bookshelves, small potted plants in the windows, and a handmade blanket on the sofa. You know, she began, as Noah finally fell asleep in his crib after taking his medication. Today was the first time I really felt like a mother. Arthur accepted the cup of coffee, arching an eyebrow. What do you mean? Before, with Richard, I was just an accessory. When I got pregnant, he controlled everything. Doctors, tests, decisions. Today, with me making the decisions for Noah, even if I was scared, it was different. You're an excellent mother, Laura, Arthur said with conviction. What was she like? Laura asked suddenly. Your mother? Arthur almost dropped his cup, taken aback by the question. No one, not even Victoria, during their years of marriage, had shown any interest in Carmela Vasquez. She was resilient, he began, his voice laden with restrained emotion. She worked as a cleaner in 3 different places, but always found time to read me stories before bed. She had this special way of making little seem like a lot. Laura sat down on the sofa, pulling the handmade blanket over her legs. And your father? Miguel Vasquez. Arthur pronounced the name as if it were something bitter. A man who confused power with violence, respect with fear. He built a small real estate empire through questionable practices. Ironically, it was this empire that I inherited and transformed into what it is today. And you were afraid of becoming like him, Laura concluded softly. Arthur stood up and walked over to the window. The city stretched out before him, but his eyes were fixed on distant memories. When I started in business, I promised myself that I would be different, more ethical, more humane. But at some point, he paused, running his hand over his face. At some point, the pressure for results, the fear of appearing weak like my mother. You're not weak, Laura interrupted firmly. What you're doing now, standing up to the council, creating the foundation, that takes more strength than maintaining a facade of toughness. A soft cry came from the bedroom, and Laura stood up instantly. Arthur watched her walk over to the crib, her protective posture so reminiscent of his own mother that his chest ached. You know what's funny? She continued, nuzzling Noah gently. Richard always said I was weak for loving books, for being moved by stories. But it was books that saved me, that gave me the courage to imagine a different life. Arthur approached the crib, watching Noah as he gradually calmed down. What kind of stories do you like? Stories of redemption? Laura smiled softly. Characters who find their humanity after years lost in darkness. Arthur's phone vibrated in his pocket. Another message from the council, probably. He ignored it. Laura, he said seriously, I want you to lead the Foundation's educational program. Community libraries, book clubs for women in shelters. Arthur, I don't know if you understand these women, he insisted. You know the power that stories have, and most importantly, you're strong enough to show your own scars as proof that there is hope. Laura looked at Noah, then at Arthur. Why are you really doing all this? Because, he replied after a moment's thought, maybe I need redemption too. And maybe, by helping you and others, I can finally make peace with that scared little boy who promised never to be like his father. The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky with orange tones that came through the apartment's windows. Noah had fallen asleep again, and in the silence that followed, both Laura and Arthur remained there, each lost in their own thoughts about the past, the present, and the possibilities of the future. It was as if the echoes of the past were finally starting to turn into something new, something that could perhaps heal old wounds and create new paths for both of them. The meeting room on the top floor of Vasquez Tower buzzed with restrained tension. 12 board members, Victoria and Bernard, occupied their usual chairs around the polished mahogany table. Arthur, standing in front of the projection screen, was presenting the New Dawn Foundation's figures. As you can see, he indicated the graphs. The initial investment of $50 million will be distributed between 3 main fronts: housing support, educational programs, and medical assistance. 50 million, Bernard practically spat out the words. Have you completely lost your mind? That's less than we spent last year on executive bonuses, Arthur replied dryly. And before you start with the usual arguments, yes, it will temporarily affect the value of the shares. No, I don't mind. Victoria stood up, her impeccable suit contrasting with her tense expression. Arthur, as your ex-wife and a member of this board, I need to express my concern. First the hospitals, now this. And there are rumors about a certain guest in the Edison building. Arthur felt his jaw tighten. He knew this moment would come, the moment when his personal and professional lives would collide publicly. Laura Collins, he pronounced the name clearly, surprising everyone with his directness. Yes, she's living in one of my properties. Yes, she will be the director of the Foundation's educational program. And no, I'm not asking anyone's opinion on this. That's a conflict of interest, protested Davidson, the CFO. No, that's doing the right thing, Arthur retorted, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the room. Laura has a background in literature, relevant personal experience, and, most importantly, understands exactly what these women need. Bernard stood up abruptly, his hands flat on the table. And what happens when the press finds out? Business tycoon shelters young single mother. The tabloids will have a field day. Let them have it, Arthur replied calmly, although his heart was racing. Maybe it's time to show that there's more to Vasquez Enterprises than quarterly balance sheets. At that moment, Regina quietly entered the room, handing Arthur a note. His eyes quickly scanned the words, and his expression changed subtly. "If you'll excuse me," he said, picking up his papers. "I have an unavoidable appointment." "This meeting isn't over," protested Bernard. "Yes, it is," Arthur replied, already heading for the door. "Regina will distribute the Foundation's complete documents. Study them. Next week, we'll start implementation." In the elevator, Arthur reread the note. Richard Collins was seen near the Edison building. His heart froze. 20 minutes later, he found Laura in the apartment, pale but composed, with Noah asleep in her arms. "The security guards prevented him from entering," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "But he was there, Arthur. How did he find out?" Arthur sat down heavily on the sofa, probably through the council. "They looked into his past." Laura nodded slowly, processing the information. "So it begins," she murmured. "Laura, if you want to give up—" "No," she interrupted him firmly. "I'm not giving up. Not this time." She cradled Noah in her arms before continuing. "Do you know what I've learned over the last few months? That sometimes the price of change is facing exactly what you run away from." Arthur watched as she kept her composure, even though she was clearly frightened. "I'll beef up security," he promised. "And maybe it's time to make everything public on our terms." "What do you mean?" "An interview," he explained. "About the Foundation, about the educational program, you as director, sharing your vision for the project. Nothing personal, just professional." Laura considered the proposal. "And when they ask about my story, you decide how much you want to share," Arthur replied softly. "But maybe your story can give other women courage." Arthur's phone rang. It was Bernard again. He ignored the call. "You know," Laura said, a small smile forming on her lips, "when I was little, my grandmother always said that the best stories are the ones that cost something to tell." "Your grandmother seems to have been a wise woman," Arthur commented. "She was," Laura confirmed. "She also said that when we find our true strength, we discover that the price of change can, however high, is worth it." Arthur stood up and walked over to the window. Below, the city continued its frenetic pace, oblivious to the dramas unfolding in the heights of the Edison building. "Regina can organize the interview for next week," he suggested. "Enough time to prepare." "What about the council?" "They'll have to adapt," Arthur replied firmly. "Just as I'm adapting. Just as we all need to adapt when we decide to do the right thing." The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the windows. Noah wriggled in Laura's arms, letting out a contented little sigh. "The price of change," Laura murmured, more to herself than to Arthur. Who knew it would be so scary and liberating at the same time? Arthur watched mother and son, thinking about all the decisions that had brought him to this point. How every choice, every confrontation, every moment of doubt, was slowly building something bigger than himself. "It's worth it," he finally said. "Every penny, every criticism, every obstacle, it's worth it." And for the first time in weeks, despite the threats, pressures, and uncertainties, Arthur Vasquez felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning of the interview dawned with a fine rain over Manhattan. In the Edison building apartment, Laura nervously adjusted the navy blue blazer Regina had selected for her, while the nanny, carefully researched and hired by Arthur, played with Noah in the living room. "Take a deep breath," Arthur instructed, watching her in the reflection of the mirror. "Remember, you don't have to answer anything that makes you uncomfortable." The New York Times reporter, Catherine Chen, would be arriving in 30 minutes. The decision to give her first interview to a respected media outlet had been a strategic one, an attempt to control the narrative before the tabloids distorted it. "What if I'm not eloquent enough?" Laura asked, her insecurity shining through. "What if I damage the Foundation?" Arthur approached, his presence conveying a calm he didn't necessarily feel. "Laura, you've spent the last 2 months developing educational programs that can change lives. Talk about that. Talk about what you believe in." The intercom rang. Catherine Chen had arrived early. Laura took a deep breath, casting one last glance at Noah, before following Arthur into the living room. where the interview would be conducted. Catherine Chen was a middle-aged woman with keen eyes behind thin-framed glasses. After the initial introductions, she organized her recorder and notepad. "So," she began, her tone professional but gentle, "are we going to talk about the New Dawn Foundation?" Laura straightened up in her armchair. "The educational program is the heart of the project," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she talked about something she was truly passionate about. "We believe that education and literature can be powerful tools for transformation." "And how did this particular vision come about?" Laura hesitated for a moment, exchanging a quick glance with Arthur. "Through my own experience," she finally replied. "Books can be refugees, but they can also be maps to a different future." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "There are rumors about your past, Miss Collins, about how you met Mr. Vasquez. Personal details aren't relevant," Arthur interjected softly. "No," Laura interrupted him, lightly touching his arm. "It's all right." Turning to Catherine, he continued, "I met Arthur when I was at a very vulnerable moment in my life, but this isn't a story about rescue. It's a story about transformation." The reporter made a few notes before continuing. "What about the board of Vasquez Enterprises? How did they react to these changes?" "With resistance," Arthur answered honestly. "Change is rarely comfortable, especially when it challenges the status quo." "Mr. Vasquez," Catherine adjusted her glasses, "some board members have suggested that your recent decisions are emotionally motivated." "And they're right," Arthur replied, surprising everyone with his frankness. "For years, I've run this company based solely on numbers. Maybe it's time to add a little humanity to the equation." At that moment, Noah started crying in the next room. Laura excused herself and went over to him, leaving Arthur and Catherine momentarily alone. "There are also rumors about Richard Collins," Catherine mentioned softly, "about his presence in the vicinity of the Edison building." Arthur felt his jaw tighten. "I won't comment on that, even if it's relevant to the story, especially if it's relevant to history," he replied firmly. "Some battles need to be fought away from the spotlight." Laura returned with Noah in her arms, the baby now smiling and babbling happily. Catherine watched the scene with professional interest, but also with an unexpected softness in her gaze. "One last question," the reporter said, switching off her recorder. "Off the record. Why are you two really doing this? With all the complications, the risks?" Laura looked at Noah, then at Arthur. "Because some stories need to be told," she replied. "Because some changes have to start somewhere." "Because," Arthur added, "sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing to do the right thing, even when it would be easier to do nothing." After Catherine left, Laura stood at the window, watching the rain that was still falling on the city. Noah had fallen asleep in her arms. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked softly. Arthur moved closer, watching the city beside her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't regret it." "Richard will read this," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll be furious." "Let him be," Arthur replied with a firmness that surprised even himself. "We can't live in the shadows forever, Laura. At some point, we have to choose the light." Arthur's phone vibrated. Another message from the council. Probably another criticism or veiled threat. He ignored it, concentrating instead on the reflection he saw in the window. A small, makeshift family, united not by blood or convention, but by choices and transformations. "You know what's funny?" Laura commented, cradling Noah in her arms. "In the books I love so much, I always thought the redemption stories were too fantastical. Now I realize that they are perhaps the most real of all." Arthur smiled softly. "Because redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to be better," she added, "one day at a time." Outside him, the rain was starting to fall, and a few rays of sunlight managed to penetrate through the clouds, creating a spectacle of light and shadows over the city. It was an appropriate metaphor, Arthur thought, for the moment they were living, a delicate balance between darkness and light, between past and future, between fear and hope. And there, in the silence of that moment, both Arthur and Laura understood that some battles are worth fighting, even if the price is high, even if the path is uncertain, because sometimes, in the deepest shadows, we find our brightest light. The New York Times story came out on a Wednesday, occupying the front page of the business section. "The billionaire who chose to change, the transformation of Vasquez Enterprises," was the main headline. accompanied by a photo of Arthur and Laura in the Foundation's newly opened library. Regina entered Arthur's office carrying several copies of the newspaper and a worried expression. "Reactions are mixed," she informed him, depositing the periodicals on the table. "Social networks are buzzing." Arthur flipped through the paper until he found the full article. Catherine Chen had done an exceptional job, balancing the history of the Foundation with personal elements without falling into sensationalism. However, one sentence in particular caught his eye. Sources close to the company suggest that Vasquez's transformation could cost him more than money. It could cost him his empire. The phone rang. It was Laura. "Have you seen it?" she asked, her voice tense. "I see it now," he replied, continuing his reading. "How's the mood in the Edison building?" "Quiet for now, but Arthur—" She hesitated. "I got an email from him." Arthur felt his body tense. "Richard?" "Yes, he wants to talk about Noah." A heavy silence settled on the line. Arthur could hear Noah babbling in the background, oblivious to the tensions building around him. "It's not going to happen," Arthur declared firmly. "Our lawyers—" "He's the father," Laura interrupted softly. "Legally, he has rights. Rights he gave up when—" Arthur stopped, taking a deep breath to control the anger that was beginning to bubble up. "We need to be careful, Laura, especially now." At that moment, Bernard burst into the office, followed by Victoria and other members of the board. Arthur said a quick goodbye to Laura, promising to stop by the apartment later. "Satisfied with your media circus?" Bernard shot back, throwing a copy of the newspaper on the table. "Actually, I am," Arthur replied calmly, leaning back in his chair. Catherine Chen did an excellent job of capturing the essence of the project. Victoria approached, her heels echoing on the marble floor. "Arthur, 3 important investors have already called this morning. They're worried about the direction of the company." "Let them worry," Arthur retorted. "Maybe it's time we all worried more about the impact of our actions." "This isn't a game," Bernard warned. "You're risking everything we've built." "No, Bernard." Arthur stood up, facing his former friend. "I'm rebuilding something better." The rest of the morning passed in a series of tense meetings and difficult phone calls. At around 3 in the afternoon, Regina entered the office again, this time with a different expression. "Mr. Vasquez, there's someone who wants to see you," she announced. "Carmen Rodriguez, from the Hospital Workers Union." Arthur frowned, confused. "I don't have a meeting scheduled." "She said it's important," Regina insisted. "Something about the community hospitals." Carmen Rodriguez was a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes and a determined posture. She entered the office carrying a thick briefcase and an air of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Mr. Vasquez," she began bluntly, "I've read the article in the Times, and I have a proposal." Over the next hour, Carmen presented a detailed plan for collaboration between the New Dawn Foundation and the network of community hospitals. It was an ambitious project that included vocational training for women in vulnerable situations, nurseries for working mothers, and preventive health programs. "Why are you showing me this?" Arthur asked, genuinely intrigued. Carmen smiled for the first time. "Because, Mr. Vasquez, sometimes we need bridges between different worlds, and you, on whether you like it or not, are building one." When Arthur arrived at the Edison building that evening, he found Laura in the apartment's library, organizing books while Noah played in his playpen. "How was your day?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Interesting," he replied, picking Noah up. "I met someone today who made me realize something important." "What?" "That maybe we're doing something bigger than we imagined," he explained, watching the baby who was smiling at him. "That maybe it's not just about personal redemption, but about building bridges." Laura put the last book on the shelf and approached. "What about the council?" "Still resistant," Arthur admitted. "But today I met people who see value in what we're trying to do. People willing to help, to build together." "And Richard?" she asked softly. Arthur handed Noah back to her. "We'll take on one battle at a time, Laura. For now, concentrate on the educational program. Leave Richard to the lawyers." Later, watching the city from the apartment window, Arthur reflected on Carmen Rodriguez's words. Bridges between different worlds. Perhaps that was what he was really building. Not just a foundation or a different legacy, but connections between realities that should never have been so far apart. His phone vibrated with a message from Regina. 3 more community organizations had contacted him, interested in partnering with the foundation. Bridges, he muttered to himself, a small smile forming on his lips. Perhaps, after all, this was the real transformation, not just personal, but collective. A change that King, like Bridges, would allow people from different realities to meet halfway, building something new together. Autumn arrived in Manhattan with a sudden change in the air, bringing with it not only golden leaves, but also the storm that everyone feared. The court notice arrived on a Monday. Richard Collins was filing for shared custody of Noah. Laura was at the foundation's headquarters when she received the news, in the middle of a meeting about the implementation of new educational programs. Her hands shook as she read the document, but her voice remained firm as she called Arthur. "He's using the media against us," she explained, locked in her office. "The headlines, the exposure. He claims I'm using Noah to get close to you, to gain social status." Arthur felt his blood boil. "Our lawyers—" "He has proof, Arthur," Laura interrupted, her voice breaking for the first time. "Photos of me, from that night, in the street, holding Noah in the cold. He's going to use that to prove that I'm a negligent mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur could hear Laura's irregular breathing on the other end of the line, trying to hold back tears. "Come to Vasquez Tower," he instructed softly. "Now. I'll get the legal team together." The conference room on the top floor was packed when Laura arrived. Patricia Winters, the company's main lawyer, led a team of 5 family law specialists. Arthur stood by the window, his tense posture revealing the gravity of the situation. "Gentlemen, ladies," Patricia began, adjusting her glasses, "we have a delicate situation on our hands. Richard Collins isn't just seeking shared custody. He's trying to destroy the foundation's credibility." "What do you mean?" Laura asked, her voice small. Patricia projected some emails onto the screen. "He's contacted several board members in recent weeks. He offered compromising information about the nature of your relationship." Arthur turned sharply. "What relationship? There is no—" "Exactly," Patricia interrupted. "But the public perception is different. The story of the billionaire who rescued a young mother from the streets. People love a romance, even when it doesn't exist." Laura sank into her chair, the reality of the situation weighing heavily on her shoulders. "He's going to do it, isn't he? He's going to take Noah away from me." "No," Arthur declared firmly, approaching the table. "He won't." At that moment, Regina rushed into the room. "Mr. Vasquez, Richard Collins is in the lobby, with the press." The ensuing chaos was meticulously orchestrated. Richard, impeccably dressed in an Italian suit, gave an impromptu press conference, tears in his eyes as he talked about his little Noah and how he was being kept away from his son. "All I ask for," he declared to the cameras, "is the chance to be a father, to be a part of my son's life. But certain people," he cast a meaningful glance at the top of the building, "seem to have other plans." Arthur watched the live feed on his phone, his jaw tense. Laura stood next to him, pale but erect, years of trauma and fear converging in that moment. "He hasn't changed a bit," she whispered. "He's still the same manipulator as ever." It was then that Arthur had an idea, a dangerous, risky idea, but one that could change everything. "Patricia," he called out, "how much material do you have on Richard Collins' business activities?" The lawyer frowned. "Quite a lot." "Why? What about his connections with certain members of our board?" A glint of understanding appeared in Patricia's eyes. "Ah, interesting." "Arthur," Laura touched his arm gently. "What are you thinking?" He turned to face her. "Richard isn't the only one who can play this game. But unlike him, we have something he doesn't." "What?" "The truth," Arthur replied simply. "And it's time to use it." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Patricia and her team delved into files and records, while Regina coordinated a carefully planned media response. Arthur made a series of phone calls, some to people he hadn't contacted for years. "Are you sure about this?" Laura asked when they were finally alone. "This could cost you everything you've built." Arthur looked out of the window, where Richard was still performing for the cameras. "Do you know what I've realized, Laura? That sometimes you have to lose everything to gain something that really matters." "And what matters now?" "Justice," he replied, turning to face her. "Truth. Doing the right thing, no matter the cost." That night, while the literal storm was brewing over Manhattan, Arthur Vasquez was preparing for his own storm. In his office, a pile of documents waited, evidence of decades of corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power, not just by Richard Collins Bystein but by everyone who supported him. "Tomorrow," he said to Laura as he walked her to the car that would take her to the Edison building, "we're going to show the world who Richard Collins really is. And more importantly," he smiled softly, "we're going to show them who you really are." The rain began to fall, first gently, then in torrents. It was fitting, Arthur thought, that the biggest battle of their lives should begin like this, with a storm that would wash everything away, leaving only the truth in its wake. "Are you ready?" he asked. Laura looked at Noah, sleeping peacefully on her lap, then back at Arthur. "Yes," she replied with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm ready to fight." The morning after the storm brought relentless clarity. The main newspapers in New York carried headlines that shook the foundations of corporate power. Empire of Shadows, Richard Collins' shady connections, Vasquez Enterprises exposes corruption scheme, The Price of Truth, the story behind the battle for Noah Collins' guard. Arthur watched the monitors in his office, where different news channels were simultaneously broadcasting the repercussions of the revelations. Patricia Winters had orchestrated a precise and devastating attack, releasing documents, emails, and financial records that exposed not only Richard Collins, but an entire network of corruption that stretched across several companies, including members of Vasquez Enterprises' own board. "The first resignation requests have already started to arrive," Regina informed us, entering the room with a stack of papers. "Bernard Whitman, Victoria, 3 other board members." "And Richard?" Arthur asked, without taking his eyes off the screens. "He's disappeared," Regina replied. "But our lawyers have already filed requests for investigations in 3 different states. The evidence is substantial." The phone rang. It was Laura. "You need to see this," she said, her voice carrying an emotion that was hard to define. "Turn the TV on to Channel 4. Arthur switched on one of the monitors and his heart almost stopped. On the screen, a woman he recognized as Richard's former secretary was giving a live interview. "Years of abuse," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not just with Mrs. Collins. There were others before her. He had a pattern. He conquered. He isolated. He destroyed. And we all stayed silent out of fear. There are more," Laura continued on the phone. "Other women are speaking out. Former employees, former girlfriends. Arthur, it's falling apart. Everything is falling apart." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of the moment. "How are you?" "Scared," she admitted. "Relieved. Guilty of feeling relieved. Noah's asleep, oblivious to it all, and I don't know what to feel." "Come here," he suggested. "I think we need to talk about the next step." An hour later, Laura arrived at Vasquez Tower with Noah. The now grown-up baby was smiling and babbling, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding around him. The company's headquarters was buzzing with activity. Lawyers rushing around with documents, journalists trying to get statements, executives trying to understand their place in this new reality. "It's strange," Laura commented, taking a seat on the sofa in Arthur's office while Noah played with some blocks on the carpet. "For so long I've lived in fear of him, of his power, of his influence, and now he's the one on the run," Arthur added, pouring her a cup of tea. "But at what cost?" Laura asked, watching the headlines that continued to scroll across the screens. "Your company, your reputation." Arthur allowed himself a small smile. "You know what's ironic? For the first time in years I feel truly in control. Not the kind of control Richard was looking for, but the kind that comes from the truth," Laura added softly. At that moment, Patricia entered the office, carrying a thick briefcase. "We have news," she announced. "The judge has temporarily suspended all of Richard Collins' parental rights, pending a criminal investigation. And," she paused dramatically, "we've received an interesting proposal from the district attorney's office." "What kind of proposal?" Arthur asked. "They want to use the New Dawn Foundation as a model for a state program to protect women in vulnerable situations, with public funding and everything." Laura stood up abruptly, picking Noah up. That would change everything." "Yes," Patricia agreed, "but we need someone to lead the project. Someone who understands both the administrative and the human side." Arthur and Patricia looked meaningfully at Laura, who hugged Noah tighter. "Me?" she asked incredulously. "But I have no experience." "You have something better?" Arthur interrupted gently. "You have the story, the truth, the understanding of what these women really need. Laura looked out of the window, observing the city that, just a few months ago, had seemed so hostile and frightening. Now somehow it seemed full of possibilities. "What about the company?" she asked, turning to Arthur. "With half the board resigning, maybe," he replied. "It's time to rebuild something completely new, something that unites business and purpose in a way that really makes a difference." Noah let out a happy laugh, breaking the tension of the moment. Laura put him down again, watching him play with his blocks, building and rebuilding little towers. "Like him," she murmured, tearing down to build something new. Arthur moved closer, watching the baby. "The difference is that he's not afraid to start again. Every time the towers fall, he simply rebuilds. With joy," Laura added, "without carrying the weight of what was destroyed." Regina entered again, this time with more newspapers and a curiously optimistic expression. "Stocks have stabilized," she announced. We've received dozens of messages of support from other companies, from social organizations." Arthur and Laura exchanged a meaningful glance. Perhaps, they both thought, reconstruction wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but about creating something entirely new from the ruins of the old. "So," Arthur finally said, "are you ready to rebuild?" Laura watched Noah, who had managed to stack his blocks into a tower taller than all the previous ones. "Yes," he replied with a smile. "I'm ready." Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky with shades of hope and renewal. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake not destruction, but possibilities. It was time to rebuild, not just structures and companies, but lives and futures. And this time, Arthur thought, watching Laura and Noah, the foundation would be much stronger than before. 6 months had passed since the storm that had transformed everything. Winter had given way to spring, and with it, a new era for both Vasquez Enterprises and the New Dawn Foundation. Laura's office on the 20th floor of Vasquez Tower, now renamed the Center for Social Transformation, overlooked the park and had walls covered in photographs. Each picture told a story: the inauguration of the first integrated shelter, the graduation of the first class of the professional training program, the smiling faces of women who, like her, had found a new path. "The figures for the first quarter are in," Regina announced, entering the room with a folder. "The state program has already assisted more than 200 families." Laura smiled, adjusting the most recent photo on the wall, Noah on his first birthday, surrounded not just by her and Arthur, but by an expanded family of foundation employees and beneficiaries. "And Richard?" she asked, although she no longer felt the same tightness in her chest when she pronounced that name. "Still in Switzerland, according to our informants," Regina replied. "The investigations are continuing, but with him out of the country, the important thing is that he can't hurt anyone anymore," Laura added softly. The intercom rang. It was Arthur, asking her to come up to his office. Over the last few months, their meetings had become more than strategy sessions. They were moments of shared reflection, of planning for a future that neither of them had imagined possible. "Have you seen this?" Arthur asked as soon as she entered, pointing to a magazine on his desk. Forbes had an extensive article on the transformation of Vasquez Enterprises, from profit to purpose, how one company redefined corporate success. "It still amazes me," Laura commented, flipping through the pages, "how something that started with so much fear and uncertainty could have turned into this." Arthur stood up, walking over to the window. The view of the city had changed for him. Where he once saw only properties and business opportunities, he now saw communities, stories, possibilities. "I received an interesting proposal today," he said. "Columbia University wants to establish a partnership, a study center focused on companies with a social impact. And they want you to coordinate the academic part of the project." Laura almost dropped the magazine. "Me? But your experience with the Foundation's educational program, your personal history, your vision for social transformation, that's exactly what they're looking for." "Arthur," she began hesitantly, "sometimes I wonder if I deserve all this. If it's not too much luck." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "It's not luck, Laura. It's the result of courage, determination, and a lot of hard work. You've turned your pain into purpose, your fear into strength." Laura's phone vibrated. It was the nursery downstairs, where Noah spent his mornings. "He's asking for lunch," she smiled, reading the message. Go, Arthur encouraged. We have the meeting with the expansion committee later. We can continue this conversation then. As Laura headed for the door, Arthur called her again. Oh, and Laura, Patricia wants you to know, the process of stripping Richard of his parental rights has been finalized. Officially, Noah is yours alone. Laura stopped, feeling the weight of that information. It was the definitive end of a chapter, the closure of a cycle of fear that had dominated her life for so long. Thank you, she said simply, but they both knew that that thank you carried much more than words could express. In the elevator, Laura reflected on how her life had changed. Constant fear had given way to quiet confidence. Desperate survival transformed into meaningful purpose. At the nursery, Noah ran up to her as soon as he saw her, his strides still unsteady but determined. "Mama!" he shouted, his favorite word echoing around the room. "Hey, little one." She picked him up, inhaling the baby smell that, even after a year, still amazed her. "Ready for lunch?" As they walked to the executive cafeteria, now transformed into a communal space where employees of all levels ate lunch together, Laura observed the changes around them. The old hierarchical divisions had given way to a more collaborative environment, where ideas and experiences were shared freely. "Mrs. Collins?" a young woman called out to her. It was Maria, one of the first beneficiaries of the training program, now an assistant coordinator. "Can I steal a minute of your time later? I've got some ideas for the next workshop." "Sure," Laura smiled, settling Noah into the high chair. "And please, it's just Laura." The rest of the day passed in a series of meetings and planning, each moment reinforcing the certainty that they were on the right track. In the afternoon, during the expansion committee meeting, Laura presented her vision for the coming year. More integrated centers, partnerships with universities, mentoring programs. "It's ambitious," commented one of the new board members. "It's necessary," Laura replied with conviction. "Every story we change creates a cascade effect of possibilities." At the end of the day, while organizing her desk to leave, Laura found a small envelope with her name on it. Inside was a simple card in Arthur's elegant handwriting. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest challenges. Thank you for teaching me that. A. B." Laura smiled, tucking the card into her handbag. Outside, the city was beginning to light up for the night, thousands of windows shining like earthly stars. Somewhere between those lights, she thought, other stories were waiting to be transformed. And now, finally, she was ready to help tell them. It was an autumn morning when Laura found the letter. She was organizing some boxes in her apartment in the Edison building, now officially hers, after Arthur had transferred the deed to her, when she came across a yellowed envelope addressed to Carmela Vasquez. Her heart raced as she recognized the childish handwriting. It was a letter written by Arthur decades ago, never delivered to his mother. "Dear Mom," the letter began, "today Mrs. Carmen told me that you are in heaven now. I promise that I will be strong, that I will do something important one day, something that would make you smile." Laura held the letter against her chest, silent tears streaming down her face. Noah, now almost 2, was playing on the carpet with his favorite blocks, building and rebuilding his own little worlds. Without thinking twice, she picked up the phone. Arthur was in a meeting when Regina interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir, but it's Laura. She says it's important." 20 minutes later, he was in the apartment, holding the letter with slightly trembling hands. "Where?" he began, his voice breaking. "In the box of old documents," Laura explained softly. "Arthur, you never told me about this letter." He sat down heavily on the sofa, his eyes fixed on the words written by a much younger and more vulnerable version of himself. "I had just found out that she—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "Mrs. Carmen gave me paper and pencil, said that sometimes writing helps to deal with the pain, but I never had the courage to deliver the letter. It seemed too final." Noah approached, offering Arthur one of his pads, an instinctive gesture of consolation that made both adults smile through their tears. "You kept your promise. You know that," Laura said softly. "You did something important, something that would make her smile." Arthur took the pad offered by Noah, turning it over between his fingers. "You know what's funny? For years, I thought I was building an empire to prove something to my father, to show that I could be more powerful than him. But maybe all along I was trying to do something that would make my mother proud." Laura sat next to him, watching Noah go back to his building. "And now, He smiled slightly. I think I've finally understood what she always said, that true strength lies not in how much power you have, but in how you use it. The intercom rang. It was Regina again, reminding them about the opening ceremony of the new reception center that afternoon. Are you coming? Laura asked, getting up to prepare Noah. Arthur looked again at the letter in his hands. Yes, he replied, folding it carefully. But first, I want to make a stop. 2 hours later, they were at the cemetery where Carmela Vasquez rested. It was a simple but well-kept place. Arthur hadn't visited her grave for years. Hi, Mom, he said softly, placing the letter under a small stone. It took me a while, but I think I finally understand. Laura held Noah, keeping a respectful distance as she watched Arthur have his moment. The normally fussy baby was strangely calm, as if he sensed the importance of the moment. When Arthur joined them again, his eyes were watery, but there was a peace in his expression that Laura had never seen before. Ready for the opening? She asked gently. Yes, he replied, picking Noah up on his lap. More than ready. The new Welcome Center was unlike anything they had done before. Located in an old historic building that had been completely renovated, it combined temporary housing, daycare, a vocational training center and medical care, but most importantly, it had a library. In honor of Carmela Vasquez, said the sign at the entrance to the space. She taught us that stories can change lives. During the opening ceremony, Laura watched Arthur give a speech. He talked about transformation, about second chances, about the power of choosing a different path. But most of all, he talked about his mother, for the first time publicly, and how her example had finally shown him the true meaning of success. This place, he concluded, is not just a welcome center. It's a reminder that everyone deserves the chance to rewrite their story. Later, when the guests had left and only the staff remained to organize the space, Laura found Arthur in the library. He was sitting in one of the reading chairs, Noah asleep on his lap, leafing through a children's book. Did you find anything interesting? She asked, taking a seat next to him. The Little Prince. He showed her the cover. It was her favorite. She used to read it to me on difficult nights. Laura smiled, leaning back in the armchair. Do you know what that means? The circle is complete. What do you mean? You started out wanting to prove something, built an empire, lost your way and then found your way back. Through stories, through different choices, through love. Arthur looked at Noah, sleeping peacefully, then at the shelves of books that surrounded them, each volume representing a possibility of transformation for someone. It's not an ending, he said softly. It's a new beginning. The best ones usually are, Laura replied, taking another book from the shelf. And there, in the quiet of the Carmela Vasquez library, surrounded by stories of transformation and possibility, they began another chapter, not just of their own lives, but of the countless lives they would touch through the legacy they were building together. If you had to choose between maintaining your financial empire or sacrificing it to do the right thing and help vulnerable people, which decision would you make, and why? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.